this morning. I know you know the challenging environment in which we all reside now. So it's an honor and a pleasure to share this morning with you, or part of it. I'm going to run about 45 minutes or so. And so there'll be plenty of time in the last 10 to 15 minutes of our hour together for questions. So please, as I roll through, I'm going to cover a bunch of different issues related to deception this morning. And as I roll through these things, please jot down, questions you might have, and we'll have time to discuss these at the end. And I want to echo Stephen's comment that it's a very exciting time to be a deception researcher, not the least of which reason is that for the first time really in my lifetime, we've had what we would call ground truth challenged, which is, there's always been a baseline truth that people can dispute, but now what that baseline truth is being called into question. And, if you don't have a ground truth to work from, how can you tell if somebody's lying? So we'll talk about that later, but let's start. I think our story really begins, and let me go to slideshow mode here. Our story begins this morning. Can people, Stephen, can you see the screen? You folks see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool, great. So, and I'm gonna go back and forth between screen share so I can see you all. But our story really begins with a bit of somewhat ancient history in December of 1981. And I was at the tail end of a very unhappy engagement with a young woman. And she and I were living together at the time in that apartment house right there you see on screen outside of Seattle, Washington, in a suburb. And our relationship had been really, really, challenged in significant measure because of lies that she'd told and various acts of betrayal, which I won't bore you with. But we made a decision that we were going to part ways. And so the last morning we were ever together, we're standing out in the driveway, which actually is where this photo was taken from, even though I didn't take that photo, but it's the same apartment building from our little driveway there. And we're saying our goodbyes, which are, is always an awkward moment when you've broken up with somebody. But I notice her car is filled to the gills with new stuff, all kinds of new belongings. And this struck me as exceedingly odd because we had no money at all. And I had no idea where she could have come up with money to buy all this stuff. So I'm looking at this, and being the very passive, indirect person I was at the time, it suddenly, popped into my mind. I wonder if she kept some of the checks from our now canceled joint account and used those. And so I looked her in the eye and I said, very indirectly, instead of accusatorily, you didn't keep any of those checks from our old account, did you? And she looked me straight in the eye and said, no, you burned them all, remember? And I said, okay, I was just wondering. And then she got in the car and off she went, and I never saw her again. Subsequently, years later, she actually now is a life coach out on the West Coast, which, is kind of an interesting postscript. But anyways, so, subsequent to this, what happened, and was within just 2 or 3 weeks, I started getting calls from creditors. And, what had happened, of course, is she'd gone out and she'd written a bunch of bad checks and signed my name to them. And in current dollars, it would be about $1,300 to $1,400 worth of bad checks with my name on it. And then, as now, if creditors call you up and say that you have a bad check, and you sit there and say, well, actually, that wasn't written by me. It was written by this other person who's now down where near Vegas or something. Now, creditors are like, yeah, right, buddy. So I had to sell all my music gear and every other possession of value I had to pay off the creditors. And transition then to 4 years later, and I'm at the University of Washington, and this, of course, is a more recent photo than then, but I'm at the University of Washington, and I'm a senior in the program of communication research there at the time, and I was an honors student. And I was working with Dr. Malcolm Parks, who you see, who's become a great friend of mine and was my mentor, Mac, as we know him. And so Max sat me down in his office one day and said, you know, you've got to do this honors thesis so you can graduate. If you could answer any question or questions about relationships and communication, what would you want to answer? And the number one question, even though, you know, because this is 4 years later now, but the number one question that still hung in my mind is, why couldn't I tell that she was lying to me? Because of course, I'd known her for 2.5 years. She was my high school sweetheart. I felt like she was the closest person in the world to me. She's standing right there and we're face to face, and she's looking me straight in the eyes and I'm looking her straight in the eyes, and she's lying and I can't tell. I mean, I'm stupid, but I'm not that stupid. I don't know. My wife might dispute that. We can bring her down and ask her, but why couldn't I tell? And in common sense terms, I think we can think of that as is love blind? That is, as we become increasingly intimate with people, does that blind us to their lies and our ability to tell when they're lying? The other question, of course, that came to mind, which I didn't study at the time, but still was in the back of my mind, was the broader question of what compels people to lie in the first place. And these two questions really constitute my research over the last 30 plus years. These have been the dominant questions that have driven almost every study I did. And I started out the first several years of my career trying to answer the first question, and I'm going to talk a fair amount about that this morning. In fact, probably the bulk of our time about that question. And then more recently, over the last decade, really shifted my focus to the second question. So flashback to then, and this is 1984 actually, so it's 3 years after the fact. And Mac and I decided we're going to do this project, and what we're going to try and do is answer the first question. And again, thinking about this in popular kind of common sense terms, it's, is love blind? Or more technically, what is the impact that intimacy has on a person's ability to tell if an intimate partner is lying to them? Does love blind us to the lies of others? And so we did what all researchers do in such situations, which is we started by reading every piece of research that had ever been done on this. And at the time, this is early mid 80s, almost nobody had studied this topic. And by nobody, I mean, there were literally 2 or 3 studies in existence across all of the social sciences looking at the All right. Can folks hear me okay? You got me, Stephen? And
yes, we can hear you.
Yes, you're good.
I really appreciate you folks hanging in there. Boy, I thought everybody'd go, okay, that's it. All right. So back to the saga. Where were we? I'm a 21-year-old and trying to figure out what the relationship is between being in love with somebody and being able to tell if they're lying to you or not. And so my advisor and I, Mac Parks, are talking about this, and we go through the literature, and there's very little literature on it. And what's more, nobody had ever actually looked at romantic involvement. So completely unwittingly, as I said right before I cut out on you folks, I'd stumbled into an unexplored area. And so we decided to study it, and we got to talking about it, and we realized that it likely isn't the case that it's just a simple, straightforward relationship between intimacy and accuracy. Instead, it's probably a more complicated causal relationship. And so what specifically we proposed was this. Something that has since become called the McCornack-Parks model. I'll talk more about that in a moment. What happens when you become increasingly intimate with somebody? And in this case, we're talking specifically about romantic intimacy. That is, you're beginning to become more attracted and kind of eventually falling in love with this person. Well, one of the things that happens is that, or so we argued at the time, will likely happen, is that people are going to become increasingly confident that they can tell if their partner's lying to them. So the closer you feel to somebody, the more you think you can tell if they lie. And chances are for most of you, if we personalize this, if, for example, I challenge you to, I'll pay you $100, if you can figure out when somebody's lying to you. And I give you the choice between a complete stranger of my choosing and somebody you feel really, really close to. Most people in that situation are going to go with the close person, because we think that if we know somebody really, really well, we know all their little idiosyncrasies and we can tell when they're lying. And what's more, we probably have little, personal models about things they do when they lie. So my partner always rubs his nose, or she always tugs on her ear or scratches her lip or something, right? And so the people to whom we feel most close, we also feel the most confidence regarding our ability to tell if they're lying. Or so Mac and I reasoned. We also thought that this is going to have an impact on whether people think that their partner is lying. Because if I think that I can tell whether or not you're lying, that's probably going to be coupled to other associated belief sets, including a generalized trust. That is the belief that you would never lie to me, something Mac and I called truth bias. Now, let me pull down the share for just a moment. This was 1984, early 1984, actually, when we were talking about this. Truth bias has since become the most researched concept in deception. So if you folks are inspired after my talk this morning to, Google stuff on deception, and you Google truth bias, you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of studies on it. And truth bias is this idea, again, to be clear, of a bias toward thinking everything partner tells you is the truth. And this is a very, very profound bias. Think about how it's operative right now. Chances are you folks sitting here right now listening to me think that I'm Steve McCornack, and you think that I'm a professor at UAB. You have no evidence to support that other than what people have told you. And nevertheless, you're thinking that what I'm telling you is the truth. We do this naturally as human beings. We're very truth biased. We actually can't make sense of other people's communication unless we start with the premise that people are telling us the truth. But Mac and I reasoned in close relationships, that's going to go up even higher. So basically, we're going to believe almost everything a person says is in fact honest. This bias toward thinking that people are telling us the truth, we believed at the time, would also drive down accuracy. So the more I think that you would never lie to me, the less likely I'm actually going to be able to tell when you do. So our overall model here was a causal chain, and what it think partner would never lie to you, and actually you're not going to be able to tell at all because of those biasing factors. And so we put this to the test. We did a study at the University of Washington in which we brought in dating couples, and we had them lie to each other, and we measured their confidence and their truth bias and their intimacy, and we looked at the relationships. And lo and behold, the model was laid out. The best fit to the data was exactly this model. And what that means in practical terms is for people who are in close, especially, I want to keep it narrow to romantic, because that's what we looked at. But if you're in a close romantic relationship and you feel super intimate toward partner, you likely think you can tell when they're lying, think that they never would lie to you, and actually you can't tell at all. Because couples in our study were running well below 20% accuracy. They were not accurate detectors. So we never called it the McCornack-Parkes model because that would just be like really egotistical. We just published this paper, and then other people started calling it the McCornack-Parkes model. So you actually can Google the McCornack-Parkes model, and you'll see this whole literature on this now. This is how these things get built up. But a number of years later, it was one study. And so then, I and a couple of my colleagues did some follow-ups and replicated it. But a number of years later, I was sitting in my office at Michigan State University. And as a graduate student, we all have our heroes. And And one of my, heroes was probably the most famous deception researcher of the era. His name was Bella DePaulo, and she worked at Virginia University. And I'd read all her stuff as a graduate student. I just, worshiped her. She's just a brilliant scholar. And so as a young professor, several years later, I'm sitting in my office one day and the phone rings and I pick it up and this voice says, "Hi, this is Bella DePaulo from, Virginia University." And I'm like, I'm talking to Bella DePaulo. and she says, "I wanted to give you a courtesy call." She's such an awesome person as well as a scholar. She said, "I wanted to give you a courtesy call because we're doing a meta-analysis on your model." And a meta-analysis is where you take every study that's ever been done and you put all those data in a big pool and you analyze them in totality. And she says, "I wanted to give you a heads up in case the model doesn't fit, in case we invalidate your model." And I said, "First of all, I really, really appreciate that's a super kind, respectful, courteous thing to do." I said, "Second, Bella, honestly, I don't think it will be borne out because we have 3 data sets on the model, but whether that can be generalized, if you asked me, I'd say probably not." So she went and she did the meta-analysis, and 6 months later, she gave me a call and she said, "Your model was the best fit for the data." So what that means in practical terms is, or in scientific terms, that means the model is robust. That is, it's held up across multiple data sets and meta-analyses. And it seems to be the case that the way that accuracy and intimacy are connected is through this string, as I explained. So that if you think about this in practical terms, what it means is the people you're kind of most in love with are also the people who are best able to deceive you, because not only are you very intimate, toward them, but you also, people typically delusionally believe they can tell if a partner's lying, and they also think partners would never lie to them. As a quick postscript on this before we move on, my colleague and my current chair, Tim Levine, and I did a number of follow-up studies related to suspicion. Because if you think about this model, what it kind of suggests is that when we trust people, we're less accurate. So you might think, well, okay, then what I'm going to do is be really suspicious. As a tactic. I will go through life trusting nobody, and then I'll be closer to the truth. We did a series of studies on suspicion, and we didn't find that people's accuracy increased much. Instead, when people are really suspicious, and some of you may know people like that in your life who just like have that mindset of, I'm not going to trust anybody because I don't want anybody to put anything over on me. In fact, what we found is people didn't get any more accurate. They just think that everybody's lying to them a lot. And so they end up very unhappy, but they're not any closer to the truth about when people are actually lying to them. So suspicion doesn't seem to be a particularly effective tactic. So given all this, how can we tell if people are lying to us? Is the next question I want to explore briefly. And to think about this, what we have to think, is look back at all of the cues that have been studied. And deception detection, folks, is like one of the most studied areas in not the intimacy realm in which I, initially explored, but just deception detection in general has been studied thoroughly, thousands of studies across 50 years now, almost all of it focusing on nonverbal cues. So what are the things that liars do when they lie? And there are global stereotypes. There are things that across the world, across cultures and across languages, human beings just believe that liars do when they lie. And when we look at the research and what the research tells us, take all the cues, the most common stereotypes that people believe in, and these are stereotypes, these aren't necessarily truths. We'll talk about that more in a moment, what the truths are. But these are the common beliefs that people have about what liars do when they lie. Number one, top of the heap, folks, eye contact. I mean, it's spoofed by everybody from Larry David in his show Curb Your Enthusiasm, where he looks into people's eyes to see if they're lying, all the way back to Aristotle, who said, the eyes are the window to the soul, and you can tell if somebody's lying by looking at their eyes. It's thousands and thousands of years. And the number one cue that people report they look to tell if somebody's lying to them or not is eye contact. Now, let me just talk about eye contact for a moment before we move on. This doesn't even pass the intuition test, if you really think about it. Think about it as a scenario in which you're going to lie to somebody and try and fool them. Once you get your story down, the number one most controllable and consciously recognized cue you're going to think about is your eyes. And you're going to focus on looking right in their eyes as you speak to them, just as my partner did all those years ago in December 1981. And yet, as detectors, we somehow forget this and we go, I'm going to look in their eyes and see if they're lying. Well, of course they're looking you in the eyes because they are lying. And yet we think that people are going to somehow look down and to the left. There's all this mythology about this. I actually served jury duty a few years ago and had a judge instruct the jury pool, watch people's eyes when they're on the stand. And I'm like, Your Honor, you don't want to do this. We'll get to that in a moment, but little spoiler alert here. Eye contact has nothing to do with deception, zero. But people believe it does, and people look to it, and people sell books that say it does. And in fact, it has nothing to do with whether people are lying. People think liars smile a lot, right? The quick with the grin liar, right? Adapters. What are adapters? Self-touching. So people think that liars, touch themselves a lot and adjust their shirts and ties or whatever. People think that liars trip over their words more. So they can't speak fluently, but they, commit different speech errors, mispronounce words and the like. People think liars are fidgety, so we shift around a lot and can't sit still when we're speaking to you, the shifty liar. And people think liars talk too much information, messages are too long, unusual amounts of detail. And so when you look at these 6 cues, and these are the 6 cues globally that people associate with lying, this actually gives you a really simple recipe for being believed. So if you're ever in a situation in which you need people to believe that you're being honest. And I don't mean situations in which you're lying. I just mean situations in which you actually are being honest, but you're not sure whether people are going to believe you. This is your list, folks, for how you can be believed. And you take this list and you invert it. And people will likely see you're honest, especially because people are truth biased anyways. So what does that mean? If I look people straight in the eye, I keep my face relatively serious. I don't touch myself or adjust myself much. I keep my speech error-free. I don't fidget, but sit or stand calmly. I keep my messages short, neat, tight, and to the point. People are going to think I'm honest. Because these are the beliefs that people have about what people do when they lie. So given this, what is the truth about nonverbal cues? And as we go into the deception detection truths, let me pull down the share for just a moment. There really is no way for me to overstate this with you folks this morning in terms of the degree to which, ironically, deceptions about deception are promulgated in our culture. Everything from talk show hosts to self-help books to so-called experts on the internet, on and on and on. It's likely the case that to this point in time, most of what you have heard about deception and deception cues is false. And the reason, one of many reasons, is that there's huge stake, the huge financial stake. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in deception detection. And undergirding all of that industry is the fundamental human desire to want to know when other people are lying to them. And that has guided almost all of the research across 5 decades now. But when the weird thing is, meta-analysis after meta-analysis, that is, every single mass scale collection of studies on cues that tries to find whether any cues distinguish liars from truth tellers finds what? There are no cues. There's not a single cue behaviorally that distinguishes liars from truth tellers across people, situations, and time. Not one. The bottom line is you cannot look to nonverbal behavior as an indicator for truth telling versus deception. And you may not believe me in this, and that's your right, because it's so counter stereotypical, but this is the science of it. And yet there's this huge just false belief set that's promulgated by all these people who have a financial stake in grant getting or other means to pitch the idea that there are these secret cues. I mean, you even had the guy, this one guy, Paul Ekman, who created the show Lie to Me, who had this idea of, well, there may be no overt cues, but they're secret. They're these secret micro expressions that people do that you can't really see, but that I can, and this kind of nonsense. And the fact of the matter is there just aren't any cues that reliably distinguish truth tellers from liars. Now, does that mean that your husband, wife, sister, brother, whoever, good friend doesn't have tells? Am I willing to grant the fact that a particular person has a tell, that, poker term for something they always do every time they lie? It's possible. It's possible. There might be an idiosyncratic cue, but realize this. To validate that cue as a reliable indicator of lying for that person, you have to have two kinds of evidence. First, they always do that cue every single time they lie. Every single time, or else it's not a reliable cue. And second, they never do that behavior when they're telling the truth. So is it possible? Maybe. But does the fact that your partner always rubs his or her chin every time they lie hold up across other people? No, there's not a single cue that does. So you can't tell from looking at behavior whether or not people are lying. We also see that people aren't very good lie detectors, period. People are in fact really bad. And by really bad, I mean, 15 to 20% accurate in detecting deception. You can train people up to be very effective. And my colleague, Tim Levine, and I, and my colleague, Kelly Morrison, and some other folks, and I'll pull down the screen share for a moment again and put it back up. We worked with the NSA high value terrorist suspect interrogation team for a year back earlier, about several years ago now, in our lab. These are the folks that debriefed Saddam Hussein, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who masterminded 9/11, and a bunch of other high value terrorists. These folks are the best interrogators on the planet, bar none. Everybody has kind of a competition. The CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the Israelis. Everybody says they're the best. The NSA, this interrogation team is the best on the planet. And so we brought these folks into our lab and to help hone their chops and being able to detect, and worked with them for 6 months. It was a fascinating time period for us, working with these folks at the front line of trying to protect us all against terrorism. These folks averaged about 95% accurate. But how they found out whether people are lying with that degree of accuracy? It was all question asking, not behavioral cues. They're not looking at eye contact. They're not looking at smiles. They're listening. They're asking super intense questions and listening very carefully to the answers. Something I'll talk more about during the Q&A if people want to talk about it. And finally, if you want to take away truths from today's session about detection, and then we're going to shift to the why people lie aspect for a few minutes before we open it up. How do people actually detect? We've done a number of studies now on how people in the real world actually detect deception, and it almost never happens the way it's depicted on TV, or in movies. That is, if you think about shows that were, 10, 15 years ago, Lie to Me and this kind of stuff, there's always this depiction of deception detection where these two people are talking and the one person starts exhibiting, these stereotypical behaviors, and the other person senses the behaviors and goes, "You're lying." Another person goes, "You caught me." And it just never happens that way. It just never happens that way. We did a number of studies in which we asked people how they actually discovered that partners were lying to them. And basically 399 out of 400 instances in this one particular study, it was indirectly. People hear from a friend that their partner lied. People find the most common way in this day and age is people find incriminating evidence. Your partner says they haven't been emailing an ex, or haven't been texting them, and you borrow partner's laptop or phone and you find incriminating messages, this kind of stuff. It's indirectly, it's finding incriminating evidence. It isn't through interrogation processes, and it's certainly not through detecting some kind of weird nonverbal cue that you then accuse partner and they confess. That's for the movies, but it's not reality, which is interesting. So with all this said, as we finish up our brief discussion on detection before we shift to why people lie, what's the practical takeaway? How can you folks double your detection accuracy within close relationships instantly? Each of you likely has a tool you can use that will immediately double your accuracy in being able to tell if close partners in your life are lying to you. You flip a coin. Flipping a coin, that is when if you're in a situation where you think somebody's lying to you and they're a close partner, and you pull out a coin and flip it, heads or tails, that will be about twice as accurate compared to if you rely on your own intuitive judgment. All right. As a final subnote, if this has intrigued your curiosity at all, the issue of detection, the single best resource on the planet, the must-read book, is Duped by the chair of our department, who is the top researcher in the world on deception detection. And if you're skeptical, you don't want to fall prey to truth bias. If you're skeptical about what I've told you folks here, buy a copy of Duped or check it out at the library and read it. It's absolutely fascinating. If you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell based his most recent book entirely on Tim's work. And Malcolm flew out here to Birmingham and spent several days with Tim. So check it out, Duped by Tim Levine. Okay, I want to take the next few minutes and then we'll open it up for questions. And again, sorry for losing my internet for 10 minutes with you. I just want to talk quickly about the secondary question, which one I've been working on more recently, which is why do people lie? And to understand why people lie, we have to understand the cognitive processes and reasoning processes that are involved in the act of deception in the first place. And to understand that, we have to kind of do a quick primer, as it were, on how cognitive theorists and philosophers of the mind distinguish between different levels of reasoning. So, because if you think about deception, what is deception at its core? It's me getting you to believe something false regarding what I believe. And so it involves pretty sophisticated thinking. I've got to think about what you're thinking about what I'm thinking. So this gets us into philosophy of the mind, and philosophers of the mind distinguish between different levels of reasoning, and it's first, second, third order reasoning and goes up ad infinitum. So let me talk with you just a little bit about the distinctions and throw some different examples and pull it into deception so we can think about why people lie. First order reasoning. Most creatures on the planet, especially mammals, are first order reasoning creatures. What is first order reasoning? First order reasoning is the ability to have thoughts and feelings. I think, I feel. Sad, hungry, happy. So I experience thoughts and feelings. Second order reasoning is the ability to have thoughts about thoughts. So I can not only feel hungry or sad, I can ponder why I'm hungry or sad. I'm thinking about my thoughts. I'm thinking about my feelings. And if you think about having thoughts about thoughts, which is second order reasoning, that really can be manifest in one of two ways. It can be manifest as self-reflection. I can think about my own thoughts, or as perspective taking or empathy. I can think about your thoughts. I think that you think. I think that you feel. Third order reasoning, then, if you just work on up, it's thoughts about thoughts about thoughts. So I think that you think that I think. And if you think, this is getting too complicated, every one of us does this daily. We think about what a partner thinks about something we're thinking. This is very standard adult human behavior. And it goes on, right? You can have fourth order thoughts, right? I think that you think that I think that you think. And if you think this is just ridiculous, well, if I think that you have the misperception about my feelings about something you said, that's fourth order reasoning. So we actually are capable of this as human beings. Well, here's the link to deception. Deception, as I mentioned a moment ago, in its true form, is me trying to create a false belief in your head about my thoughts or feelings or something I've done. So it's third order reasoning. I think that you think that I think. It would seem to require third order reasoning. This begs the question then, are dogs capable of deception? So Daniel C. Dennett is probably one of the most famous living philosophers of the mind right now. And Dennett tells this wonderful story about a friend of his, I'll call him John, who has this dog. And John and his dog are always fighting over this comfortable chair. It's John's favorite recliner chair to sit in. It's also the dog's favorite chair to sit in. So one day, John is sitting in his chair and the dog comes up to him and the dog's like, the dog wants in the chair. And John's like, I'm in the chair. So the dog's like, wants in the chair. Go away, I'm in the chair. So what does the dog then do? The dog sulks. Because those of you who have dogs, dogs will mope. So dog is sad. So then the dog goes to the front door and barks and scratches at the front door, like the dog wants to go out. So John starts to get up out of the chair. And as soon as he gets out of the chair, the dog bolts for the chair, jumps into the chair. And what does John say? You tricky dog, you fooled me. You got me to think that you wanted to go outside when actually you just wanted the chair. So if you think about that, that's third order reasoning. Dog pretended that dog wanted to go outside to get John to believe that dog wanted to go outside. Well, Daniel C. Dennett says no. And I'm sorry to break it to y'all, but dogs aren't that smart. There's a lot of actually debate about whether dogs are empathic. Do dogs have higher order reasoning? But I'm telling you, it's really hard to sort out because for 15,000 years, dogs have been socialized across generations for one purpose, which is please people. So we can't sort out whether they're really empathic or whether they're just well-trained generation after generation to serve us. But anyway, so Dennett says, no, the dog isn't that smart. In fact, it's all first order. So what's the first order explanation? Dog wants in chair. Chair's not available. Dog sad. Dog decides outside, outside, outside. Then what? Chair becomes available. Dog goes to chair. Happy, happy, happy. But of course, the human being sits there and goes, you tricky, smart dog. So if dogs aren't really capable of deception, and given our time, unfortunately, I think this is where I'll end up. The question then arises, are children, small children? And the answer is it depends. It depends on their age. Because human beings, for all our sophistication and reasoning, when we're super young, that is the first couple of years, we really don't go beyond first order. We think and we feel, but we don't perspective take. We don't think about what other people are thinking. And that cognitive threshold is huge and generally occurs for most children after the age of 3. So if we presume that deception is this act of involving higher order reasoning, can really young children actually deceive? And this was put to a test very famously. And this is my favorite deception study ever. So I'm going to walk you through it real quick, and then I'll wrap up, and we'll chat a little bit if you folks have questions. By a researcher named Joan Peskin. And here's what Peskin did. She brought 3-year-olds into her lab, and she sat them down, and she laid out 3 stickers on the table. And there was a plain bright color like yellow or blue. There was a plain brown sticker. And then there was a sticker that was shiny and sparkly and had a bunch of stars and moons and stuff on it. And then she asked the 3-year-old, which you get to take one of these stickers home. Which sticker do you want to take home? And of course, 100% of the 3-year-olds said the shiny, sparkly one. So she said, okay, now I'm going to bring 2 puppets into the room. One's a good puppet and one's a bad puppet. Each of the puppets gets to pick a sticker too. The good puppet doesn't want to make you sad, but the bad puppet wants to make you sad. Here's the experimental instructions. Think about what you can do to keep the bad puppet from taking your sticker. So she brings the puppets in, and immediately upon entering the room, the bad puppet says to the 3-year-old, which is your favorite sticker? Close to 100% of 3-year-olds say what? The shiny, sparkly one. The bad puppet takes that sticker. The 3-year-old starts screaming and crying. They put the stickers back on the table. They take the puppets out of the room. She says, you saw what just happened. We're going to bring the puppets back into the room. Think about what you can do to keep the bad puppet from taking your sticker. The puppets come back into the room. The bad puppet says, which one's your favorite sticker? What does the 3-year-old say? Second trial. Shiny, sparkly one. The bad puppet takes their sticker. The 3-year-old starts crying. She puts the stickers back on the table, takes the puppets out of the room, says, you've seen what happened twice now. We're going to bring the puppets back in one last time. Think about what you can do to keep the bad puppet from taking your sticker. So brings the puppets back in. The bad puppet says, what's your favorite sticker? What does the 3-year-old say? Shiny, sparkly one. And when the bad puppet tries to take it, they attack the puppet. So 3-year-olds reason, I can attack puppet as a strategy to keep the puppet from taking my sticker. Then Peskin brings in 5-year-olds. Separate experiment, same design. First trial, the puppets come into the room. Bad puppet says, what's your favorite sticker? What does the 5-year-old say? Brown one. That's the difference between 3 and 5. Human beings learn they can manipulate language so as to create false belief states in the minds of others. And I was going to talk about elephants and also some of my recent work, because elephants are super smart and will also deceive as well. We just don't have time, because I want to open it up for questions. I will say this in closing, though. Again, I apologize for my internet cutting out, so we lost 10 minutes. My own recent work really, this sets the stage for my recent work, and my recent work, in a very simple summation, gets to the answer of why then do people lie? And there are any number of reasons why people lie, but the dominant reason, and that's what we're exploring, is they lie when they have problematic information in their heads. So when people have done problematic things and somebody asks them about those things, so that information somehow becomes relevant to the situation, then they have a choice to make. Do I share that information or not? And they recognize, and this requires higher reasoning. This is why I talked about the higher reasoning. They recognize, if I share this information with you, that's going to make you angry with me, or I'm going to get into trouble with you, or whatever. And so that's when you start seeing people inclined to deceive. And most everyday deception is born out of the fact that people have problematic information in their heads, information that could get them into trouble in some way, shape, or form. What this means also, if you think about it implication-wise, is that instead of, I think the cultural characterization of liars, so-called, is that lying is the moral failure. And in fact, I would argue a bit differently than that. I would say lying is an outcome of moral failures. So if you think about it, if somebody lives a life in which they don't have things in their head they need to hide from other people and say false things about to cover up, then they have no need to be dishonest in their messaging. So actually lying is an outcome or byproduct of living unethically, rather than being just the unethical aspect in and of itself, although it's undoubtedly destructive as well. So I had 10 more minutes of stuff I wanted to walk you through, and I'm so sorry that we lost that time, but I'll open it up for questions. Anything and everything you ever wanted to ask about deception before we end this morning.
If you want to ask Dr. McCornack a question, you need to unmute your microphone.
Question, Phil?
Yes.
Okay. What the current president is doing is deliberately distorting or lying about very relevant subjects by the fact that we give him the thought that maybe he's distorting things for the greater good. He says, I can tell them this is not a bad situation because I know that there is a more difficult situation that I am protecting them from. Does that make any difference?
This is an excellent question. We've had 3 consecutive panels in consecutive years dedicated at national conferences and regional conferences dedicated exclusively to exploring Trump's lying. It's by any standard, regardless of your partisan beliefs, it is an empirical fact that he's now said counterfactual statements more than 20,000 times in the office of the presidency. So this represents, by any standard, what we call in the industry a prolific liar. The issue, Ronald, is that I think you have to distinguish between normal lying versus pathological lying. And normal lying, as it were, what we consider normal lying, which I would say we're all guilty of at one point or another in our lives, where there's something hurtful we don't want to share with a partner, so we decide, I'm just gonna, this is problematic, it's not gonna help things, so I'm just gonna kind of hide this and not say it. That's what normal people do, right? That is, normal people, as I argued a few moments ago, when they have problematic information in their heads, it might be just something you find it hurtful. That's what compels them to lie. In Trump's case, he lies for about everything. I mean, and it doesn't seem to be compelled by necessarily a strategic gain or to hide something negative, although often it is. But you take, for example, my personal favorite, actually, of all of the various things that have been said. And again, if you're very, very pro-Trump, you can fact check me on this and watch it for yourself. At multiple different public events, he has referenced the fact that his father was born in Germany. And yet he knows that's not true. And he knows it can be fact checked. And yet he keeps saying it again and again, that his father was born in Germany. And his father wasn't born in Germany. His father was born in the Bronx. So what possible reason could motivate him to say that his father was born in Germany? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's when you get into the pathological liar. And for your pathological liar, there actually is no rhyme or reason for why they lie necessarily. They just lie, sometimes for recreation, sometimes because they feel like it, sometimes to cover things, sometimes, and it's just, and so you can't, it's a black hole to try and make sense of why pathological liars lie. And I ran into this at age 18.
Yes.
Bring it full circle with the story I opened with this morning, because when I finally pinned her down and asked her why, if you could mute your microphone, please, for just a sec, why she lied to me, she looked me straight in the eye again and said, I have no idea why I lie. And that's the true confession, ironically, of a pathological liar. They don't even know why they lie. Other questions?
Well,
Yeah.
if Donald Trump lied about his father on repeated occasions, is this maybe some indication of frontal lobe dementia or something,
Yeah.
in which he actually thinks that his
Okay,
father
so-
was born in Germany and he's just simply confused.
So here's, and I don't mean this in any way patronizingly or condescending. I just mean this straight up, just like straight up. I would characterize your question as what rational people do when they're faced with the irrational. That is, and this is what I and my colleagues have been doing for the last 3 or 4 years, is we're faced with something that is absolutely unexplainable. But our natural compulsion of human beings is to render it explainable. So what we want to do is look for some rational explanation for this. And one rational possibility is, oh, he's just suffering dementia. But I honestly don't see much evidence that he is. Having had a grandfather who had Alzheimer's and stuff, his behavior isn't random and disassociated. His behavior quite commonly is very strategic. It's again, the rational, non-sociopathic person trying to make sense of the pathological liar. And it is a black hole. I'm telling y'all, because this is what I went through 40 years ago with my partner. When you try and make what cannot be understandable, you just get sucked in. You can lose all your energy. And I don't know how many of you feel as fatigued as I do, and my colleagues do, trying to make sense of the random reasons. But at a certain point, you just got to go, he just lies and I'm not going to worry about why. And just, we need to move on. So that's my long-winded way of saying, I don't think it's dementia. I think it's just unexplainable. I think it's just pathological lying. And this brings up a really important point for you folks to know before we part ways. And I'll be happy to hang out a few more minutes if people want to. I don't know your schedules, but I can hang out for another 5 to 10. One of the research areas that's happened is looking at distribution of lies. And this is actually a really important point to consider. That is, when you map what percentage of the population habitually, regularly lies. And there have been global studies on this by my colleague Tim Levine and my colleague Kim Sirota. And what we find is a very small percentage of people do almost all of the lying. It's almost the same distribution as serious criminal behavior. Because if you're familiar with criminology, what we know is the distribution of crime is not normal. It's not a nice, normal bell-shaped curve. In fact, a very small percentage of the human population does almost all the serious crime. And so there's this super high probability, small subset, and everybody else is pretty much honest. And that's what we see within deception, is the average person doesn't lie very much at all. But there is a very small percent of the population, about 1%, that are known as prolific liars. And these people lie 10, 20 times a day. And Trump is kind of the classic prolific liar.
How much money and time has the CIA and all these other people spent on trying to solve the problem that you say hasn't been solved, that you can't tell who a liar is? But I get the idea they spend a lot of time and money looking.
Oh man, it is. It's just money down a rat hole too. It actually makes sense. Okay, so like, I'll try and make this as brief as I can. In the 1960s, this really heated up as an area, and it makes sense intuitively that the first place to look would be nonverbals. And so it was driven by what's known as the nonverbal leakage model. The nonverbal leakage model is that liars get really nervous, and so they leak certain behaviors that they can't control. And so if you know what those behaviors are and you can spot them, then you can detect. And this model dominated up until the early 2000s. In the wake of 9/11, there was a trigger moment, though, where we said, we're going to get serious as a government and try and figure this stuff out. And at that point, there was a serious parting of ways across different domains. The FBI stuck with the cues-based leakage model. The CIA, on the other hand, and I know some CIA interrogators, they went through the what's the ridiculous euphemism? enhanced interrogation techniques. Basically, we're going to torture people. And so the black sites in which they physically tortured people were largely CIA operated. The NSA went in a very different direction. They said, Q's models aren't working. We're going to focus on question asking and not trying to detect deception, but trying to corner people through inconsistencies. And so they have to confess because there's just too many contradictions. And the NSA's approach was the one that really won the day. And the FBI since has switched much more to focusing on types of questions that are being asked. The CIA is still doing whatever they're doing. But to get back to your question, billions and billions and billions of dollars. And quite honestly, a number of my colleagues in the broader field, not at UAB at all, but in the broader field, we're making money hand over fist. The person who came up with the idea, the leakage idea in the first place, Paul Ekman, he pulled in tens of millions of dollars in grants. And finally, in the early 2000s, his stuff was so refuted. This is a true story, folks, because I know this guy. This is hilarious. I alluded to it earlier, but here's the quick, overview. He got his grant funding pulled, and everybody recognized that his work was crap. So what did he do? I kid you not. He wrote a screenplay and moved to Hollywood and pitched it to studio folks there. It was a screenplay for a show called Lie to Me, in which he was the central character. But instead of Paul Ekman, it was Leichman, right? And Leichman is this all-knowing wizard who nobody can fool because he can see deception 100% of the time. That was his self-characterization. And he did this, and the show took off and became this hit and became a cultural phenomenon throughout the early 2000s, promulgating the idea that there are these secret things going on with micro expressions that normal people can't see, and this kind of nonsense. So it's billions of dollars, and it's still going on with polygraph because polygraph doesn't work either. But there's a multi-billion-dollar polygraph industry globally too. So.
Okay, I have a quick question, and
Sure.
it's probably been refuted. Okay, and I went to two different drying out sessions with an alcoholic, and that person lied, and they said it's confabulation, which means, as I understand it, they don't know the answer to the question, so they make it up and then they believe it. So how much is that? Has that been debunked as well?
No, I think that when you look at human memory, and this is one of the most fascinating areas that's just begging for future work. Very few people are looking at this, actually. But you look at the nature of human memory, I think one of the most common beliefs people have is that human memory is like some kind of recording in our heads, but it is not at all. It is constructed and it's constantly altered and changed. And you can very easily create false memories in people's heads, regardless of age. So if you go to a sibling or something and you say, I was thinking the other day about your birthday party back when you were 12 years old and how grandma gave you that one particular gift and you started crying about it because you were so upset. And your sibling will go, I don't remember that at all. And you're like, really? And then you add a little more detail. Don't you remember it was that, that it was that weird stuffed animal? And you're thinking, why do I want a stuffed animal when I'm 12? And they'll be like, I don't remember that at all. And you're like, okay, never mind. And then over the next couple of days, you just keep coming in and go, you really don't remember when she gave it? And you add a little more detail and you keep priming and priming and priming them across a series of days. By the end of about a week, that person will have a very vivid memory of their 12-year-old birthday where they got the stuffed elephant or whatever from grandma and how upset they were, so much so they could pass a polygraph test. It will now be a lived event that actually never happened. So memory is quite mutable. And if people have a particular stake in something, especially if it's addiction related, they can, over a series of tellings, create an event in their own mind that actually may never have happened. And that gets all the way back to the earlier question of does Trump, is Trump actually lying? In some instances, he might not be at all. I mean, when you throw in narcissistic personality disorder, which is, diagnostic in his case, pretty much given all his behaviors, he likely believes that his inaugural crowd was bigger than Obama's and stuff, right? I mean, you hook him up to a polygraph, I think he'd probably pass the flying colors, even though polygraph doesn't really work. But so yeah, to pull full circle, it could very well be the case that if a person makes up a story over time, if they keep telling it, especially, it'll just keep doubling down in memory. And then 10, 20 years later, it's what happened.
One last question. Is there any truth in truth serum?
I don't, well, chemical inducements are one of the ways that the CIA goes, drug people up. And the answer is yes and no. And let me link it just quickly before you folks take off for the morning with my elusive comments on polygraph. If we drug people up, we can put people in such a relaxed state that they no longer feel like there's any consequences to what they say. Alcohol does that, right? I mean, to a certain degree, alcohol is a depressant. People consume enough alcohol, it dumbs down their inhibitory impulses enough that they'll say stuff that they normally wouldn't say, right? Because they just don't, they don't feel in an anticipative way anymore the consequences. But if I pump you full of some really serious sedatives, the world's a great big happy place and I'll just say whatever and, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And so in that sense, yes. But does that mean because I inject somebody, they now are going to be truthful? No, I mean, not absolutely. It just means they're going to be more relaxed. Okay. Polygraph. Just know that polygraph is probably the most abused technique on the planet. And all that polygraph does is detect arousal and pretty non-specific arousal indicators. And what it doesn't detect is whether is the source of that arousal. So if you're telling the truth and you recognize that I don't believe you, and I ask you, did you, kill your partner or whatever, some super high provocative question, you're likely to see a huge arousal spike. I can't distinguish between that arousal jump is due to lying or telling the truth. So you have to ask yourself when you hear people talk about polygraph, why is it inadmissible in any court of law? And the reason it's inadmissible in courts of law is because people know it's nonsense. That being said, and this is an important final kind of postscript on this, the NSA interrogators use polygraph. And I hung out with the head of the interrogation team, Dan, and he talked about polygraph. And you know what he's told me? He said, polygraph isn't a box to detect lies, but it's a really useful tool to get people to confess. Because if I can get somebody cornered and I think they're lying to me through their contradictory answers over a 4-hour interview, and then I tell them, the polygraph says you're lying. If they are lying, usually at that point they'll confess because people believe that the polygraph is a magic box that detects lies. And so you can use polygraph as a tool to exact confessions from people. But is it a magic black box that tells when people are lying? No, it's not. It's just an arousal indicator. And that way it's kind of analogous in ways to just a blood pressure measure or a, heart rate monitor or something like that, right? It's just watching people's arousal, but we can use it in interrogations to kind of intimidate people and get people to confess.
Well, Dr. McCornack, we've appreciated you giving us this very interesting talk today. And we will record it, make it available on our YouTube channel, and we will welcome you back sometime if you would like to give us.
I would love to come in and talk sometime more about the why people lie and how people actually lie, because people very rarely say false stuff.
I see.
What they do instead is just play with information in all kinds of incredibly creative ways. But you folks have been a wonderful audience, and I just really appreciate you hanging in there. And I apologize again for wasting 10 minutes of your time this morning with internet crashed. So I hope you folks stay safe in these crazy times. And I look forward to the possibility of meeting with you again.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. And let me just remind everyone that tomorrow we're having Todd Rath from Alabama Power talking on smart neighborhoods. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, I'll see you folks.
All right. Bye.
Thanks.
Very much.
That was really good.
Yeah.